So our final speaker is José Miguel Vivanco. We have 8 minutes per speaker.
Thank you very much. I will try to do my best to adjust my presentation, my remarks to the limit of the time that we have. Well, first of all, thank you very much to the National Endowment for Democracy for inviting me to participate in this panel. It is always a pleasure to discuss and to expose human rights problems and human rights conditions in one of our countries in the hemisphere that is perhaps the one that has today the worst human rights record in the region, and it's a country that has been for many years very close to my heart. We are always trying to figure out different ways to try to influence or improve human rights conditions in Cuba, unfortunately without much success. Human Rights Watch has been assessing, monitoring the human rights situation in Cuba for nearly 2 decades. Over that period, Cuba has consistently stood out as the one country in the Western Hemisphere that represses nearly all forms of political dissent. The Cuban government continues to enforce political conformity using criminal prosecutions, long and short-term detentions with no due process, physical abuse, surveillance, and yes, even travel restrictions. The very poor state of human rights in Cuba has not improved since the handover of power from Fidel to Raúl Castro. Now, I think everybody here agrees that any objective assessment of the human rights record of Cuba is not only very poor, but is not improving, and in many ways, the hope that this is going to change depends on the type of pressure that we are able to bring upon that regime, what type of effective pressure could be exercised to press that government effectively to improve conditions and to move toward democracy. For as long as Cuba's repressive machinery has denied its people their most basic rights, the U.S. policy toward Cuba has neither weakened the Cuban government nor, unfortunately, improved the situation of human rights in Cuba. In my view, looking at this problem for, as many of you, for many years, the policy of isolation has helped to consolidate the Castro's regime's hold on power by providing the government with an excuse for its problems and a justification for its abuses. The policies of all or nothing approach aimed at overthrowing the Cuban government limits the ability of the U.S. to chart a middle ground in bringing about change in Cuba. That is fortunately beginning to change. Human Rights Watch was very encouraged by President Obama's lifting of restrictions on travel and remittances for Cuban-Americans, restrictions that we had long criticized for being both harsh and, once again, ineffective, and for infringing on international human rights standards. However, we cannot stop there. Within the United States, this action must be part of a broader re-evaluation and reform of a failed policy of isolation. One example of hope is the Freedom to Travel to Cuba Act, recently introduced in Congress, which would effectively send tens of thousands of Americans to the island. Another is the discussion between Washington and Havana about resuming high-level negotiations on immigration issues. Both initiatives would represent further steps toward ending our all-or-nothing approach to Cuba. Yet, if we truly want to make progress, to bring change in Cuba, we must look beyond the borders of the U.S. Just as the U.S. policy aimed at isolating Cuba has been counterproductive for advancing democracy and human rights in Cuba, so has the practice by many governments, of democratic governments, from this region and from other regions, of turning a blind eye to the Cuban government's record of abuses. While the U.S. must change and adjust and reassess its policies toward Cuba, so must countries in Latin America and Europe should acknowledge the real problems on the island and work to change them. Only by working together to forge a targeted, multilateral, not unilateral, multilateral approach, we will have the political power and the moral authority to bring change to Cuba. I will conclude by telling you that, in my view, the recent experience in the OAS in Honduras, where it was finally approved in a multilateral negotiation, a resolution that canceled the suspension of Cuba from 1962, but established as a preconditions for Cuba to rejoin the Organization of American States, to comply with very specific principles of human rights, separation of power, and democracy, which are part of this resolution, is precisely the type of multilateral diplomacy that we should try in this region and in other regions to engage with this issue of lack of human rights respect in Cuba, and by engaging the region in a common agenda that hopefully will exercise the right type of pressure on Cuba and not continue to make the embargo against the Cuban government the central issue or principal issue of attention in other regions, instead of looking at the real problems, which are lack of respect for fundamental freedoms and human rights in that country. Thank you.